our first in-person Stakeholder Tri-City team meeting. I feel like I know you, but we'll hopefully have some opportunities for everyone to get to know each other if they don't already. I'm Lisa Chronister. I'm the Assistant Planning Director, and I'm joined today with by other planning staff, of course, Jeff Butler, our Planning Director, Marilyn Lymansdorf, who you were previously introduced by email at least as the project manager for the code update project. So I started off as the project manager. That's how I know most of you, but I have transitioned the day-to-day management of the project and you to Marilyn. Before her role as the Code Update Project Manager, Marilyn worked with Sarah Welch doing development review. So she's very familiar with our codes and the process. So Marilyn's project manager. Jeff and I are still very actively involved as project directors with assessing and monitoring our progress and direction, and making sure we get to where we need to go. So Jeff, Marilyn, Katie Friddle, our manager of our current planning and urban design division, also our historic preservation officer, a very new employee, Veneri Mujica Ortiz, who is our new comprehensive planner. You will be working with her more as the code project progresses. And then Kim Cooperhart, who many of you know from her work in the commercial district revitalization program. Kim is the manager of our planning, development, and implementation division. Also with us is Mark White, who you have met at least via Zoom. And he also spoke at our design review committee and commissioner training about almost 2 years ago. And we are waiting on another consultant, Brett Keast with Kendig Keast, who is also working to develop the code, and he'll be doing a big portion of today's presentation. So with that, I would like to invite everyone here to introduce themselves, especially since as a group we haven't had the opportunity to meet together. So let's start with Jorge.
Jorge Charico with Miles Architecture.
I'm Joel Dixon. I'm a professional engineer and independent consultant here in Oklahoma City.
Todd Stone, Oklahoma City Council for Ward 4.
Jim Prairie for President. Mark Zidzel with Johnson & Associates.
I'm Emily Pomeroy with the Center for Economic Development Law.
Asa Highsmith, Ward 6 Planning Commissioner.
Department of 316 Planning and Structural.
Ophelia Cancio with Gonzalez Civil Engineering.
Nathan Cowell, American Investment.
Janice Powers, I'm the Ward 2 Planning Commissioner.
Todd Booth, residential developer, home builder.
Clay Farhad, commercial development.
Christy Summer with DBG Construction.
Bryce Thompson, Cord Construction.
Okay, great. Welcome again, everyone. So our agenda for today is we're going to spend about 2 minutes reviewing Plan OKC, the comprehensive plan. We've reviewed it with you several times before, but we want to catch you up on some very key concepts. Then we'll talk about, why do we need to update the existing code anyway? What are some of the issues? Some of you know what they are, but we'll go through those. And then we'll present what I know many of you have been waiting for since the inception of the committee, and that is to get into, what does a new zoning code approach look like? What does it look like? What are the issues that it solves? And how can it help development of all kinds? And then we'll go through some specific examples of rural and urban development, and then along the way we'll capture your comments. So did I forget anything for introductions? So, like I said, so our goals, the number one purpose of this meeting is to present this zoning code approach. I'm calling it the proposed zoning code approach. We think it's a good one. We need everyone's feedback. Again, understand how this approach helps resolve issues that have been identified in the code diagnosis and in other discussions and documentation along the way. And then we'll talk about what our next steps are. So with that, I'll hand it off to Jeff.
All right, thank you. Welcome everybody. Happy to be here in person again. And this is kind of a bit of a, like when you come back to school after summer break, just a tiny bit of review and then we'll get into the meat. But just wanted to refresh our memories because we've been busily working, this group, and since we met, busily working on the sign code and a lot of other things that we are responsible for in the planning department. So we're in a good position there, and we've also been working over the past, several months on what you're going to see here today, just kind of tossing ideas back and forth with the consultant and internally, firming up what we think is a good draft approach, not to the level of detail that that we're ready to roll anything out per se, but something that we wanted to show you all and just start kind of talking about and have discussion. So a lot of it won't be, some of it won't be new, some of it will. We talked about when we very first started the diagnosis that was done. So we'll cover a little bit of ground there, and that diagnosis alluded to some of the approach that you're going to see. The rest of the approach comes from what's on screen right now. And Plan OKC, just as a reminder, that's the city's guide. It's a policy document. It's not, of course, code. But we are using that as a starting point for setting our goals, kind of what do we want to accomplish. So these outcomes, they were listed in the diagnosis. And each of these outcomes has at least one, in a lot of cases, several Plan OKC policies that kind of tie into it. So this was a way of summarizing, okay, what do we have to do with all, what does Plan OKC say we need to accomplish? So Benary was introduced a minute ago. She's our newest comprehensive plan. She's responsible for the comprehensive planning program in our planning department. So she's responsible for that big, thick document, Plan OKC, and helping us to implement that, tracking implementation. So she's going to be working closely with Marilyn, Lisa, and I to make sure that Plan OKC gets implemented through this process. Because a lot of Plan OKC, when I say a lot, I don't know, it feels like over half of the policies, but address the development code update. If you look back historically, when people would plan cities, they put a plat out. They'd have various rules and basically simple things. And I think today, in my mind, that's kind of what a code is. It's like this is how the city should be generally as we build. So highlights of this slide. That top one is just really critical. Integrate uses while ensuring compatibility. The Planning Commission, a lot of their work has to do with mediating between uses. And that's going to be even more important as we move forward because we're trying to get away from the kind of the old notion when zoning was new. It's like, hey, you just throw those residences over there, you throw the industry over there, and you just keep them all separate, and never the twain shall meet. Well, that works okay. It's really nice and simple. But it has a lot of downsides, including a lot of travel time, a lot of congestion. It's just not very sophisticated. We have so much better tools nowadays. So we think that we can integrate these land uses, make a more walkable environment, and have a code that really facilitates that. So we want to increase densities where appropriate. We want to mitigate negative impacts of this increased compact development and integrated development. So we really want to focus on the compatibility, improve connectivity and walkability. We want to look at our parking standards and see where parking minimums aren't really a thing in the downtown area. They are in other areas. We want to take a look and see if we can make some adjustments there. We're not really going to get into that today. That's a detail that we'll get into further down the road. So that's an aspect of the code that you can expect to see and talk about. We want to look at open space, streetscapes, environmental quality, look at our landscape regulations and design regulations, just to kind of do the next generation, see what we need to do to improve those, to make them better for developers and, of course, the residents. Make sure that we're just bringing everything up to the current state of the art. So I think with that, that concludes my little portion here. Just a brief reminder that here's the land use topology system that we have, the LUDA map. We refer to them as LUDAs. Just kind of rolls off the tongue. It's better than LUMAs, which some cities use. I think that was Charlotte, but anyway. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and give it to Mark, and I'll introduce Brett. Brett, if you want to stand up real quick. This is Brett Keast, just literally came off the plane, and he'll be also helping out and taking a significant part of this presentation. So with that, I'll hand over to Mark.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. And I'm going to talk about the easy stuff, which is what's wrong with the existing code, and then Brett's going to talk about the hard stuff, which is how we're going to fix it. So if you have any hard questions, save those for Brett. If you have any easy ones, I'll be happy to take those as we go. So the question that always comes up whenever a comprehensive plan, like Plan OKC is done, is, why aren't our existing codes adequate to implement that? And it's important to keep that in mind in the context of what the comprehensive plan is and what the comprehensive plan is not. Plan OKC is the city's official statement of long-term land development land use policy. Plan OKC is not a law. It's not your zoning district. It's not development standards. And a lot of these policies that you saw, like increased walkability, we can't just adopt a one-sentence ordinance that says, all development has to comply with Plan OKC. Because if I saw increased walkability and I'm trying to design a project, that could mean 20 different things to 20 different people. So we're here to try to build some consensus and to develop standards that refine and flesh out what those long-range planning policies mean on the ground. And so we're here today, when Brett comes up, we're going to get into what really becomes the DNA for the rest of the development code, which are the zoning districts, because those tie together your uses, your dimensional standards, and everything else, and then the rest of the code, even your development standards. We'll talk about that later too. Parking and landscaping and so on and so forth can work differently in each of the districts, which kind of in a nutshell is the issue with the code today. So in 2017, the city commissioned another consultant that came in and did an analysis of your code and talked about, the things about it that were good and the things about it that were insufficient to implement this city's long-range planning policies, and also to do some other things that I've never heard anyone disagree on. Like, first of all, make the code easier to understand and easier to use. I've maybe had one attorney in my 30 years of practice say, why are we making the code easier to use and understand, right? Even attorneys usually want the codes to be easier to understand and to use on the ground. So we want a code where it's easier to find information, easier to read, easier to understand the language, it's more graphically illustrated, and all of that. So some of the key findings of the report were, first of all, that the base zoning districts that you have, there's about 26 of them, just aren't effective. They don't have the tools baked into them that you need to make those comprehensive plan goals a reality. So you have some missing standards for one thing, and you have some regulatory barriers on the other side. So we want to get all that right. We've talked about this before, but overuse of PUD and SPUD, your plan unit development, your simplified plan unit development, has always been what this, in Oklahoma City is not different than a lot of other cities I've worked with in doing this. The city uses that case-by-case negotiation process to help fill in those gaps. And there are issues with that we'll talk about later. There's multiple layers of regulations. You've got overlay districts, and different development standards, and you can have. Well, we got a slide on this later, but just looking at your zoning district tells you very little about what the rest of the code requires for an applicant, which is confusing not only for the applicant, it's confusing for people sitting behind the permitting counter, it's confusing for people who live near a proposed development. And so we want something that really puts on Front Street what the character of all of those districts is going to be. Parking regulations are outdated. As some architects I've heard say, form follows function. Form also follows parking. And that has to work differently in different parts of the city to deliver that character that Plan OKC is talking about. I think that's one of the most important regulations because parking can take up a lot of space on a property. The uses are fairly narrowly defined. They're both a little bit out of date and they're too narrowly defined for some of these properties. So we need to build in some flexibility while at the same time protecting the character of neighborhoods that people live in and invest in. In the rural parts of Oklahoma City too, the development standards are just simply ineffective. And I think what Brett is going to talk about a little later gets into pretty good detail on how that works and does not. And the processes are very complicated. So we want to make sure that the processes are streamlined, and one of the things we always try to do is to make the right things easy. I mean, if you're doing something that's consistent with the plan, your permitting process should be easy. It shouldn't be difficult to go through. So the base zoning standards really don't have much of a nexus with the city's desired character of different parts of the city. As you can see, just on the top row, the setbacks are not that much different between these three districts. The building heights are exactly the same. We just have one minimum front yard requirement, and it's very suburban. Even though some of these districts are in urban locations, we're pushing buildings further from the street. And a lot of the districts only allow single family, so they don't open the door to other housing types that the city needs to meet the demands of future growth in Oklahoma City. It starts to take up a lot of land because low density single family development just simply it just occupies a lot more land, and it can displace land that could be used for other types of housing as well, and this dilutes the distinctions that the plan calls for between these different character areas. And so you can see here, I mean, these development standards, in addition to not being illustrated, I mean, this is all text, and those of you who are engineers and architects and planners understand what all this is. Somebody who lives in the city looks at all this and they just see numbers. They really don't see what the city's intention is for each of these character areas. And the same with uses. The uses aren't tailored very well to all of these districts. As you can see, these are Ps all the way across, whether you're in a very low-density agricultural district or a higher-density multifamily district. And so there's no context. Sometimes the uses are so narrowly circumscribed that when a building changes uses over time, people have to ask for rezonings and things like that. And they're also cumulative. So we also have an issue, and this is an issue a lot of times with like industrial land, that we want reserved for economic development gets occupied and developed by other types of uses that are appropriate. So we need to take another look at how those uses work, and that's what happens with the zoning districts. And again, parking isn't tailored to context. It's the same parking ratio regardless of where you are for most of the districts. We don't look at how wide the streets are. We don't look at whether streetcars are available or not, or some other way of getting around. It doesn't consider affordability of units. I mean, parking is another thing that is a cost input for development, and maybe building that into product types that are affordable, for example, something we need to look at. And it requires a lot more pavement, and there are policies in Plan OKC that talk about protecting the natural environment and managing stormwater better and all of that. So a lot of surface parking is at odds with all of that. Now, we also recognize, this is a city where most people get around by car. It's going to be that way for the indefinite future. in most of Oklahoma City, we have to have parking somewhere, but it just needs to relate to the context better. So, as this slide shows you, land use isn't a great proxy for the character of an area. All of these areas are R1. Some of them are fairly dense and compact. Some of them are fairly low density. And the development pattern is dispersed and more rural in character. But it's the same exact district. So we want to make sure that the standards in those districts, even if it's the same land use, deliver the outcomes that Plan OKC calls for those areas. And the zoning regulations right now just don't do that. A lot of our bulk standards don't do that as well. It's the same front setback, the same building height, things like that. Again, don't vary depending on whether the context is urban or whether it's suburban. In fact, like most codes, of its generation, most of those, and lots of the city, are very suburban in character, even as the city grows and needs more land for other types of development. As I mentioned earlier, the code is multi-layered, so you can be in a community commercial district, you can have an urban design overlay, and you can also have a second overlay on top of that. Each of those pile on an additional set of regulations. And a lot of those standards make sense for the context of the area. It's just that you got to start looking at different parts of the code to figure out just what your basic development standards are. So we're working on consolidating those, not just to make the code easier to read, but to be more transparent and more deliberate about what the city's intention is for the character of those communities and those zoning districts. And so when somebody wants to get away from the rigidity of some of those standards or the rigidity of your base zoning districts, the tool has been PUDs and SPUDs, which have the advantage of flexibility. I mean, you can negotiate, if you're looking at this from the city's perspective or a neighborhood's perspective, you can negotiate better development standards, better design, mitigation, and that sort of thing with developers. From the developer's standpoint, you can negotiate flexibility. So without having to go to the Board of Adjustment and prove that you've got a hardship, which is a hard thing to do legally, you can go in and vary your parking. And this shows you some of the typical modifications that have been granted by the city's SPUDs over the years. You can vary parking, landscaping, signs is one of the big ones. The bulk regulations, your setbacks, your building height, coverage, and so forth. And then the champion here is uses. Most people use PUD and SPUD to vary uses. So maybe if we had a code that's more flexible about use, but incorporates dimensional standards and design standards that would have been negotiated by the developer, it's an easier process for everyone. If I live in that neighborhood, I know what's going to happen on that site. I know it's not going to be the product of some long negotiation where I don't know the outcome, and I have to show up at every meeting, and I have to weigh in on everything. If I'm the developer, that takes time. It's expensive. There's a place for PUD and there's a place for SPUD. But we can take some of those conditions and some of those uses and things and look at what has come out of those and start to develop standards that take us out of having to do all of that. Over 24% of the city's land area is in PUD and SPUD. That's 2,400 different development codes effectively that staff has to implement and keep track of, and etc. It's over 55 square miles of Oklahoma City. That land area is bigger than the entire city of St. Louis. And if you're not familiar with St. Louis, that's the second most important city in Missouri. I'm from Kansas City, sorry, I had to say that. But an entire major city has a smaller land area than what Oklahoma City has zoned as PUD. You have entire swaths, as you can see in that map, that's purple. Entire areas of the city are zoned PUD. So you can't look at that area, you can't look at the map and determine what the character of development is going to be in that area. It's hard for neighbors to know what's coming. And so we want to make sure that development that's compliant with the plan, that complies with the standards that the city agrees are appropriate for those locations. Again, it's easier to do. It's not the exception. You don't have to come in and beg for permission to do something. And so what we've done, and again, the plan, as I mentioned earlier, is not law. There's a separate process that we're going through to develop all of these standards, what those zoning districts look like, what those parking standards are going to be in different parts of the city. We're reaching out to the public. We're working hard with you all to make sure that these things work on the ground. We had a survey that we did this summer. It went from July through September. There were different surveys for downtown, the urban core, rural areas, and one other area, Maryland, I think, just outside of that. Yes. And so we got a lot of feedback, and this sort of buries some of the differences in different parts of the city and what we heard, but some of the major things that came out of this are things that reinforce the policies you see in Plan OKC. So the number one issue for Oklahoma City residents was sidewalks, bike lanes, and trails, sort of that non-motorized transportation network is something that Oklahoma City residents are very concerned about getting. Now, obviously, some of that's development, some of that is capital improvements. Not all of that is zoning. The number two issue was community appearance and traffic flow, sort of came in a tie on that one. As you know, sometimes solving both of those problems can be a little bit internally inconsistent, but there are ways to deal with that. But we want the population here is very concerned about the physical outcome of development, what buildings and streets look like, and they also want things to work efficiently. And then the number three issue that came up was flooding, stormwater, runoff, access to parks, gathering spaces, and nature. And so that led us to starting to think about, instead of just parks and open space, and instead of just stormwater management and things like that, we're trying to consider maybe building in like what we're calling amenity space in a new development. And so we're going to talk about that in a second too, that can make it easier for applicants to provide all of that. And so some of the things we heard relate directly to what we can do with zoning. We heard a lot about strengthening neighborhoods. And so obviously those base zoning districts, that package of use, that package of building design and setbacks and so forth, are going to relate directly to the quality and character of development that are talked about in each of these LUDAs. Diversifying the housing stock is something we heard about. So we wanted to expand the types of housing that are allowed in different zoning districts in the city. It's something that urban planners call the missing middle housing. Sort of that transition between your traditional low-density, single-family detached product, which is very popular, and that sort of high-rise, either high-rise multifamily or mixed-use development. And there's a place for that too. That there's a lot of housing in the middle that there's a demand for that can help meet housing that people need, and also provide a good transition between some of those lower-density neighborhoods and more higher intensity development in centers. Expanding access to sidewalks and trails is something we can deal with through that amenity package we're talking about. The amenity space can be part of that. And then dealing with traffic. And this isn't part of the zoning districts necessarily. I mean, we can have standards and metrics for street connectivity that would work one way in the rural areas where that's less of a consideration, and another way in urban areas where a highly interconnected street system is very important to achieve walkability. So I'm going to turn it over to the star of the show now, Brett Keast. And Brett's going to talk to you a little bit about how we're starting to build new zoning district categories that relate directly to the LUDs. Here you go, Brett. Take it away.
Thank you, Mark. Pressure's on. So this is a significant opportunity for all of you that are sitting in this room, because through this process, whereas the plan lays out kind of a vision, and most people can agree with the statements that are in the plan, we're getting to the point of writing law. And what comes out of this is what will be built on the ground. So all of you have the opportunity to have a hand in deciding, how this community builds out in the coming decades and what that looks like and how it functions. So this is kind of a critical part of this process. Mark talked about the zoning districts that you have now, and we've spent the last several months, Mark and I both have been doing this for 30 years, we've spent the last several months trying to unwind it ourselves and trying to figure it out. So you can imagine what somebody that's not in this industry has to figure out, rely heavily on staff to help understand it. So Jeff introduced to you the land use typology areas. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So each of these colors on the map represent different intensities or different densities. You might look at it as, the far out areas of being the most rural that are likely to remain rural. And as you work your way into the city, that density continues to increase, and we start thinking differently about land use and differently about how we design it and develop it to the core of the community, of the city. So each of these LUDAs basically spell out what the vision for them are, generally what the range of densities are. There's a measure called floor area ratio that's just basically the amount of building floor area you get to the lot, so basically how big your building can be. And so we started looking at these and figuring out how can we craft districts that are going to implement these. Now, way back when I was a young planner, I always struggled with the idea of having this future land use map. And then one of these areas having 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 zoning districts in it that have all different uses and all different densities and things, and thinking, how is that giving us direction when that's painting the picture of what we should be in the future, but yet it doesn't really tie into the zoning districts. The zoning districts aren't making that come to life. So what I feel like is this image, this future growth map, if you will, future development map, each of those colors should represent a different character. Now, when I mention character, I'm talking about kind of the physical differences between development that distinguish one development from another. Mark showed you the 3 images that were all zoned the same thing, but they had different patterns. When you drive into those neighborhoods, they'll have a different feel. And that's the reason why you guys buy into those neighborhoods, because you like the neighborhood, right? And there's certain things that happen in terms of how that's designed to make that come to life. So we're trying to put all those standards together so that when you have different areas on this map, they are physically distinctive, so that they have their own unique character, as opposed to just kind of having a whitewash of a lot of neighborhoods that have a lot of sameness. There's not a lot of differentiation, as they were showing you with some of the setbacks and so forth, regardless of what district you might be in. So right now, everything is primarily predicated on land use, and there's long lists of uses in each of the districts. And as Mark showed you earlier, many of those uses are permitted across all districts. So really, regardless of where you are, what the intended character of those districts are, it can still be single family, and they have a minimum lot size which you can exceed, so you don't really have a lot of certainty as to what's going to develop. And of course, that's a concern if it's the field in the back of your house or your lot, right? So what we're looking at doing is baking in a lot of these standards that the city already has in code with a lot of these design districts and overlay districts, but making them part of the base districts so that we can create districts that are distinctive from one another. So we know from one area of town what the street types need to be. We know how you're going to walk from place to place. We know what the buildings are going to be, where they're going to sit on the lot, how parking is going to be handled, what type of amenity space or green space there's going to be, and basically paint that picture so that we can build out that map and people will know what those colors on that map represent. So if you think about it, this is pretty simple stuff. When you think about from the far out rural areas, everything's green, right? It's open land. You might have some farm sheds or some farmsteads, but otherwise it's timberland or farmland, and it's very, very green. But as you work yourself from the rural low all the way over to the urban high, that green is replaced by what I call brown and gray, which is buildings and parking, right? It becomes a lot more intense. So that's kind of this continuum that we're looking at. So those are the metrics that we can use to start creating places that reflect a rural area versus places that reflect urban and everything in between by utilizing some of those metrics and how we calibrate those metrics. So context is obviously important. We can think about a restaurant that is out on the far extent of the community. It's a sit-down restaurant. But we also have a restaurant downtown. It's the same exact use, but the context and the character is entirely different. So the use has very little to do with that context or with the character of that development. It really comes down to these metrics and the design of that site to create those different contexts. So we could put a use in most any place. It's the same use, but it really depends on how we design and how we integrate it into that area. So this kind of shows some images that represent some of those different LUDAs or those typology areas. Now, ultimately, we're going to be going over every one of the LUDAs. As I'll show you here in a moment, they all have their own descriptions of what those represent, the general types of uses that you'd see, and like I said, the amount of densities generally that you'd see, a range of densities, and they spell all those out. So we'll be covering all of these, but for the purpose of today, we just wanted to focus on a couple of them, the rural and the urban, which make up the largest part of the city and its zoning. So on the far left are the descriptions of the LUDAs. So you have a rural low. I mean, that's as rural as you're going to get, right? Your current district that you have right now is AA, right, which is a 5-acre lot. Now, I grew up on a farm, and where I grew up, we had 7,000 acres. So 5 acres wasn't going to do me a lot, right? So when we think of ag areas, we're thinking of areas that are being farmed or pasture land or, some other operation of that nature. If we start dotting the countryside with homes on 5-acre lots, which, is an attractive option for people to get out and get some elbow room, then we end up with a lot of driveways, and we start encroaching in those agricultural areas, and there become issues with odors and with dust and heavy equipment traffic and things of that nature. And so it creates a conflict or issues with compatibility. So what we've done here is we've identified different districts for those areas. So we're saying there's a RLAG, which is the ag area, which would be a minimum of 20 acres. The plan actually talks about 40 acres, all to be determined. But those are the areas that are intended to be, remain as ag land, whether it's livestock or whatever that they may be doing. So we're tying all of the proposed districts back to the LUDA. So you see the RL, so you know that you're in a rural low. And then we're describing, we're describing what those are with, residential areas within a rural area, and then rural commercial, which would be more things that cater to that, ag environment. It might be feed stores, or it might be some type of convenience, or perhaps a gas station. But we're not going to see it stripping up and down every single road in the rural areas, because first, we don't have utilities, and it's not an appropriate use there. So this starts to show you kind of the layout of the LUDAs and how they transition to what we're proposing, and then what the districts are in your current ordinance.
So, did you say the acreage for the rural low would be 20 acres?
That's yet to be determined.
Okay.
Like I said, the comp plan says 40 acres. It may be 80 acres for all I know. We're kind of viewing it as maybe an opt-in district. So if you're a farmer out there and you have no intent of developing and you want to protect your farm interests, that's the district that you would want to be in, because you're not going to have other development, suburban development, encroaching into your farmland and creating problems. So we haven't done any analysis, we haven't done any mapping, we haven't had any further conversations to really know what that should be. But it would be, acres, large acres. And a commercial in that environment will look much different from a commercial gets into rural medium and then into the urban. In the rural areas, it's not going to be a tremendous amount of standards, but we're concerned about where they place it, how they take access to the road, maybe how far they're separated so we don't get, clusters of uses stripping out along rural roadways and things of that nature. So this starts to paint a picture of what some of those districts are and how they relate to your current districts. And then they kind of continue through the urban high, urban commercial. You have, your large malls and regional districts along some of the interstates and highways, and then working our way through downtown.
Would this eliminate historic preservation?
Absolutely not. No, historic preservation is not zoning per se, but it is, it's usually in a zoning ordinance to protect those historic properties. Usually there is an overlay district that would define the boundaries if there is an actual historic district, or there may be historic landmarks or individual properties. So that will all be part of the code ultimately.
Yeah, well, you say you want to simplify it, but, the proposed districts, you got twice as many as the current districts. I mean, how is that simplifying it? To me, it seems like you're adding more complexity to it.
Well, here's the difference. When I come into a community like this, you're exactly right, and staff will tell you, my first goal was to reduce the number of districts, try to consolidate them and have fewer districts. But what I came to realize was there's a lot of diversity across this city today, and we need to be able to accommodate those types of uses. So by simplifying, we're talking about instead of having a base district, an overlay district, and sometimes you have overlay districts and overlap other overlay districts, and they create conflicts and inconsistencies. They're all in different places of the code. What we're talking about doing is creating a base district, and it's inclusive of all the standards for that base district. So that's one way. Also, we can create by right options that don't warrant a rezoning, so they don't warrant a process. All the standards are built into the code. Whereas right now we have the PUDs and SPUDs, those are kind of standards to be determined, right? They're all negotiated. So nobody knows going into it what the outcome of that's necessarily going to be because it's negotiated. We feel like we can simplify this for developers by giving them a range of options so they have the flexibility, but spelling that out very clearly in black and white. So when they come into the process, they know where the city has set the bar, they know what the expectations are, and they know the steps that they need to get there, and we're going to increase their level of certainty or predictability going into that process. The reason why there's so many PUDs and spots being used today, that's the first sign that your base districts are not working properly, right? Because people are having to do something different because the code isn't set up to address them. So we shouldn't have to go through a drawn-out process to have what we all consider to be good development at the end of the day. So we can absolutely simplify at the end of the day. These are still being, kind of worked over and mulled over and trying to figure them all out.
Just real quick, okay, what if you have a piece of parcel and it has existing zoning? What happens there?
In most cases, it's transitioning, right? So the boundaries essentially stay the same, and the name changes. We're very careful in looking at the uses that are permitted, so we're not down zoning. So one of the things we do first is we model all the current districts so we know exactly what densities they're getting out of those properties, and we make sure that anything new, they're not losing density, they're going to get at least equal, and then we can give them options to actually get more density as well. We'll go over that. So we want to make sure that if you're zoned whatever you're zoned, that there's an easy transition, that we're not turning everything on its head and everything's all new. It's basically taking some of the current districts that are mapped today and leaving most of those boundaries there, and then just having a new designation and the new standards that would go with that.
And oftentimes, Clay, communities will often say, when they are transitioning, they'll say, hey, you can keep your old zoning, you can choose, we're good with either one, the old or the new, so that there isn't that shock.
Our goal is to make landowners, developers want to take advantage of the new code because they can avoid a lot of the drawn-out process, a lot of the frustrations and the costs by streamlining a lot of these processes. So we can take some of that out, again, like I said, by creating by right alternatives where you don't have to rezone because you want to change a setback by 5 foot. You can do those things within that district, whereas today you might have to go, through a rezoning process.
Oh, real quick, just to kind of reiterate, trying not to be redundant, but, that's good question, Clay. Like, comparing the numbers, it looks like we have a lot, similar number of districts. What we're trying to do is kind of mass customization. We're trying to customize without having to go through PUD. So we're trying to, this whole notion of context-based is what's critical about this setup. So that you just go and you say, what's my zoning? This is what you can do, and it offers me all the flexibility I need to ideally, so I don't have to go get an SPUD or a PUD. If we were to really fully populate this, we'd have thousands of PUDs over there in the current districts. And like Fred said, that tells you right there we've got a problem. We're not having the flexibility that's needed, and we don't have the context. So many of our PUDs, we've had some come through recently that I can think of, that are, hey, there's a, say a C3. A lot of these districts are designed for a suburban environment, but we're using them in an urban environment or vice versa. So we have to go and we have to retool this district thousands of times over, and we keep doing that as the years go by.
And so, just right, really there's 2,400 districts that are the PUDs and SPUDs. And then there's all the combinations of overlay districts over all these base districts. So we feel like we can untangle that and create many fewer districts ultimately, because we won't need all the overlay districts. We can use those as standards that we build right into the districts, so we don't have to have all that added complexity. So if people are using a PUD or a SPUD today, we showed you why they're being used, right? So we can just accomplish the same thing in the base districts by looking at the use types, and some uses may not be allowed, or some uses may have to go through, have some other set of standards with them in order to be permitted. So we don't have to go through that process and that time and the unknowingness of going in that process when we can spell all those things out. So we go back through, look at that history, and we start building those into the new regulations.
One of the things that I feel like this might be a weeds item, but I feel like it has so much impact on character, which I know we're talking a lot about, is really what happens between curb to curb. The street's character.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to throw anybody in the bus, but I feel like our traffic department here in the city does not work well with our planning department. That's my opinion. And I feel like specifically some of our, some of the current character of the city is based on the street. It's like 23rd Street up here, right? At some point, this was obviously mainly, or maybe not mainly, but it had a good amount of single-family residential. At some point, we came through and widened it and made it 4-lane. And now every one of those houses seems completely out of place.
Yep.
So to me, there's a lot of this that happens where traffic will come through and decide, well, it's a traffic flow issue, right? It's one of our items that we're trying to address here, but it has no corresponding zoning impact. The zoning will stay the same, but suddenly the character's changed. And so my one goal through this process is to try to connect those two, because I think it's critical. And so I'm throwing that out as just something I continuously see all the time.
Yeah, Asa, we have some slides coming your way in a few minutes that talk directly about that.
Right.
So right now, when you have a use matrix and it says multifamily, say it's 20, 30 units per acre. So if we use that to design our transportation system, but right now, single family can be in there. So even though it's zoned for 30, 40 acres, it might be 3 units per acre. So we have no reliance on the zoning map. That zoning map we should be able to model traffic off of that zoning map, because those districts should be specific enough, and you know what densities are going to come with that. And you know what the stormwater runoff coefficients are going to be from that development, right? So that's what we're trying to get to, rather than, doing everything on a case-by-case basis.
I have another question over here.
Yes.
Two quick ones. So is what is being proposed a map rewrite that is going to be adopted by City Council that is going to change existing property owners zoning, kind of the first question, the second kind of goes with that, how does that affect existing PUDs and SPUDs?
Well, those are, if they're already approved, they have vested rights, right? If they've got an ordinance already, they will be able to continue to proceed, under that ordinance that's already been approved. Oftentimes when we do this process, we try to create districts that it would be an advantage to not be in a PUD, and would be much simpler to build out your project phase over phase under a base district as opposed to needing to have a PUD. Because every time you have to come back and do revised plans, and when you're developing, things change. And so,
but if you have C4 today, and it ends up going to, whatever urban low, you are going to change that zoning.
well, it'll change the nomenclature, right? It won't be a C4 no longer. It'll be, like RDRC or something like that. The use mixes, since your uses are cumulative right now, so you can have a single family across all these different districts. We will be taking a look at the uses and making sure that those uses are appropriate for those contexts and those districts.
So how does it affect existing properties built out according to the bulk standards of a C3? Someone comes in for a remodel permit, a new parking lot. Is there an expectation that they're going to have to be brought up to a standard that might have different setbacks? How do other cities work through what is likely to be a...
Yeah, we have a part, we usually do these updates in what we call modules. And so later on, right now we're trying to decide what set of zoning districts makes the most sense going forward. We will circle back, later in the process to decide, okay, now we got people with existing plans, right, in progress, or an existing building, right, where you want to pull a remodel. What do we do about that? So we will go through all of those options once we get to that point in the process. So, there's a lot of ways we can get there. Jeff mentioned earlier, if you've got existing plans under the existing zoning district, we just allow you to proceed. You can use the zoning that was in place before, or you can choose to go into the new zoning. And I think, what Brett was saying is, I think there's going to be a lot of advantages to proceeding under the new regulations. It's going to be easier to build. There's a lot less discretionary review. I know if I want to build something, the last thing in the world I want is a public hearing and all that, that long negotiated process, and I don't know what's coming out of that black box. I'd love to be able to just look at the regulations and know what's expected of me. So there may be a lot of advantages to the new.
That's what I was getting at, as to whether or not it's actually like an actual map rewrite, or we're going to be operating with essentially two zoning codes with people who have vested rights in C3 and existing bulk standards. Because I think that's two very different outcomes.
Well, and there's ways of melding them together. So, there's cities all across the U.S. that have done what Mark and Jeff were suggesting there. And there's other ways that you can, write a code that understands that we're inheriting a lot of developments on the ground now. What's there is what's there. And we're not going to require that they tear 5 foot off their buildings, so they'll be a setback. In fact, I've written ordinances that say, if you were lawfully built and lawfully platted, you're conforming, you're not non-conforming. So it doesn't throw you into that non-conforming box just because we changed the rules on you. Right? So there's a number of different ways that we could deal with that. Just please understand that we're very cautious and very concerned about creating non-conformities because that opens the whole can of worms itself. Right? So we want to try to minimize that to the maximum practical extent.
I just don't want to be a board of adjustment every month.
Yeah. No. Honestly, we like to put the word adjustment on work.
Right.
Right? As much as we can.
Excuse me. With respect to the comment that Mr. Bacher made and your response to it, I guess I feel almost compelled to point out that the other reason why we use PUDs and SPUDs a lot in City of Oklahoma City, there is this issue of flexibility and that aspect of PUDs and SPUDs and that aspect of the way in which our current system does not work. But there is at least as much, in my view, about SPUDs and PUDs that has to do with providing a level of recognize that this is a really delicate balance here, but I don't want us to just be so focused on the issue of flexibility that we neglect the other side of that coin.
Yeah, so as Jeff was talking about earlier, this country has been zoning properties like you have zoned properties. And these ordinances evolve over time and they change, and that's why you end up with overlay districts and all those types of things. You're exactly right. At some point, those two districts that are much different from one another have to come together. And so the question is, how do we treat those? There's a lot of treatments that we can do, everything from being concerned about the uses to making sure that we're tapering buildings so we don't have tall buildings directly across the lot line from small buildings. They have to be stepped back. To having different buffer yards requirements with vegetation or and they're basically the buffer area that's required is based upon the intensity of the adjacent uses. So those are things that we can actually build right into the standards to resolve the problems of compatibility that we now have because we don't have those standards. Right? So we can provide neighborhood protection and make sure that neighborhoods maintain their value and enjoyment and don't have a shopping center, with trucks parked 20 feet from their back fence. There's a lot of different ways that we can resolve that by writing good standards.
So you had also made the comment earlier that PUDs and SPUDs will continue to have a place. And I guess, my comment about that is, no matter how well designed, there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. There are always going to be, specific needs for flexibility or for additional protection or whatever that do not rise to the level of a Board of Adjustment claim, do not rise to the level of a hardship. And it seems to me that, and I guess I'm asking if you agree, that whatever that continued place for PUDs and SPUDs would be, even in a system like we're comprehending here, that it would be to address that. Situations in which, the hard and fast regs just can't be stretched or fixed.
So our goal is to make sure that buds and spuds aren't the default, which most of the time they are today, right? So the reasons why they're doing buds and spuds, we can resolve those in the base districts so that all those people who have been doing buds and spuds to date don't have to use that mechanism anymore because they have a route that gives them the needed flexibility to accomplish what they need to accomplish under base district. Much simpler, much quicker, right? And if we spell out the regulations in black and white in the regulations, so everybody knows coming into the process what's expected of them, if they submit a compliant application, they have a very high degree of certainty that they're going to be approved, right? Where a PUD, all bets are off. You don't really know what's going to come out the other end of that. So, as Mark was saying, PUDs do have a place. As they were originally intended, they were to be for the ultra unique. Somebody wants to do something really out of the box, and we just don't have anything in the toolbox to address it. That was supposed to be the use of the PUDs, but they've kind of morphed over time, as you've seen, here in Oklahoma City. So, they can still have a place.
And the other issue is, since we've done 2,400 of them, if you go back and read a lot of them, which I've been doing the last 3 years, Janice and Asa and everyone that's served on the planning commission, y'all done a lot of work helping us to what is buffered, what is not buffered, what is parking, and so we have 2,400 cases of what we think is good development or what solve problems in certain areas, and even by Buddha, which is operating. And so for someone like me and them, it's, hey, like we have our Claire rule now, the 10-foot whatever buffer with trees on 20, that's a good rule for us to consider, and codify. So I'm excited about all the ones we have because they're good, pieces of information.
Your ordinance won't say you need to have a 15-foot buffer that's heavily vegetated. It's going to say you need to have a 15-foot buffer that has, seven of these trees, 5 of these trees. It does or doesn't have a fence, shrubs, evergreen, deciduous, and give you flexibility so that the property owner can make the decision as what they feel is the best opportunity for their property, the best for them. but it's going to meet the standard regardless of what they choose. Okay. So when you have minimum setbacks, I would venture to guess that in nearly all cases, they're exceeded. You know, where a shopping center puts a building to the back and they fill up the front with a parking lot. And so in some cases, depending upon the character and the context, you may want to bring that building to the street and create more of a walkable type of urban environment. So we can spell out those things in those areas where we have, you know, building types, how they're landscaped, how people get in and around, how they park these uses, so that you get predictable outcomes. So we don't just throw minimums out there and really kind of rely upon, you know, that application and whatever they may bring to the table. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these standards that we can use from rural to urban. Like I said, the proportions change from rural to urban, and Mark introduced this idea of amenity space. Okay, so right now you have a district, you have uses, and you have setbacks. But then you also have stormwater requirements, you may have parkland requirements, all those other things, but they're not integrated. So you have to meet them, but they're not all in one place. So we want to basically identify amenity space that meets all those requirements together. And then it looks at the densities you get and how you can get equal or even greater density. So we'll talk about that in terms of, you know, open areas, and of course that's different from urban and rural as well. In the urban you might have more plazas or, you know, outdoor seating areas or something like that, whereas in a suburban area it might be a park or a playground or a greenway. We also talk about, this is to your point, sir, about streets. You know, a lot of cities just say we have collectors and we have arterials and we have highways, and this is the right of way and these are the lanes. And that's what we do all across the city, irrespective of where it's at. And so these streets can be designed as a big part of the character. They can be designed based upon the context of where they're at, and designed to move the traffic from the traffic that's needed based upon the intensities of use in that area. So street design will be, you know, an important part of this as well. So we have, you know, different streets for different contexts. Yes?
I'll tell you right now, you're gonna have trouble with those 10-foot lanes. Our traffic department does not like anything below 12.
Yeah, pay no attention to numbers on here. Those are just images that we grabbed just to illustrate. But that's a good point.
Well, that's to say though, I like 10-foot lanes.
Yeah, they should be 10 feet, especially in the city.
Yes, the traffic department doesn't overrule the city council. So, I mean, if we adopt
I love to hear
code
that, yes.
with 10-foot lanes, then it's 10-foot lanes, and they're going to have to work with that. So that we're going to have dialogue with them as well. I mean, they're in charge of that, but we're going to have discussions with the traffic folks on what those
And fire's going to want to get fire apparatus through. So there's a lot of questions to be answered and a lot of discussions to have here. So this is kind of looking at what we were looking at before. So let's talk about the rural approach. We want rural to remain rural. In areas that we don't have utilities, we don't have infrastructure. So we don't want to allow them to kind of slowly over time kind of urbanize by 5-acre lots and everybody having driveways out on those roads. And then we finally get there with utilities and we're ready to build it out. Now we have a driveway every 50 feet up and down there, and we can't acquire the necessary right-of-way. We just create problems for ourselves. So how do we do that? How do we maintain that rural character? So you've got rural low intensity, then rural medium intensity. These are like the summaries from the LUDAs of, you know, applies to large-scale acreages or outlying rural areas, but on the periphery of the urban area. In other words, they're going to be urbanized before the rural low areas are going to be urbanized. And then the types of what the intended character is and what the densities are. So you notice that top one, it's the rural of the rural, but right now it's a 5-acre lot. And to me, that's not rural. So we want to create a district. This is a case where you don't have a district. We need to add a district, right? Because we don't have a district that provides for 20 or 40-acre lots for the people that are in that area that want to continue doing what they do. They don't have any foresight of developing.
Yeah, well, that, maybe I'm not understanding it, but this has always been an issue for me. And you mentioned St. Louis. St. Louis, half of it is in St. Louis city, half of it is in St. Louis County, and the city suffered because of it. Because the city got boxed in, the city limits. And I'm all for people living in the rural areas, but the city's going to grow. I mean, it's going to grow more dead and gone. And if you do the zoning where it becomes like an urban growth boundary like they have in Portland, I mean, how is that going to work? Okay, this guy's got rural, he's zoned rural, and then somebody buys his land and they want to turn it into housing because the city's grown. I mean, what happened there?
Yeah, well, that's the
Good question.
yeah, good question again. The purpose for what Brett's talking about is really for residential developers to have something to work with when when the urban growth when urban growth gets there, when we get utilities and roads out there, that there's some land to develop. There's a 40-acre chunk or a 160-acre chunk instead of nothing because it's all chopped up into 5 and 2-acre lots. That would be the purpose for that particular zoning district. Now maybe that nobody takes us up on it and everybody wants to keep their 5-acre ability to do that. I mean, we'll have to see how this discussion goes, but that's kind of the theory behind it and the reason for Plan OKC delineating these areas that are urban future so that we won't, because what I'm concerned about is in certain areas where we have kind of some water and no sewer and that type of thing, we're essentially making an urban growth boundary with rural development. So when housing developers, they're going to look at that and say, well, I guess there's nowhere left to go in the southwest area or the northwest area because it's all been chopped up into 2 and 5-acre, 1-acre, half-acre lots, and they'll go somewhere else. Which, maybe that's okay. It depends on your perspective. But from a regional perspective and a street congestion perspective, it has some downsides. It means people are traveling farther to get to work and all this kind of stuff. So,
That's,
yeah.
I think that's an interesting point with Tinker Air Force Base being our largest single-site employer in the state. And we've got it surrounded to the right with that green loop.
Yeah, and the reason for that was that's a great point. When we did this map, utilities was like, man, we've got water like crazy out there. It'd be great to urbanize it. And we thought, well, it would be, but the problem with that is there's no sewer, and all that dark green is pretty much all developed as kind of low density residential already. And so there are pockets where you can put urban development out there. It's just going to be expensive to get out there.
Actually, water and sewer are in the process, I guess, going over there now, especially with that Midwest City.
Yeah, up to
Park,
the north side, yeah.
And I know we're getting ready to do some development in there, which personally I think is needed. I mean, all this right now, it's interesting because all of it right now is 5 acres or more under the current LUDA, which really, kind of to your point, kind of stems it from, or keeps it from being developed more of a R1, which I'm okay with. But
Well, there's a place for 5-acre estate lots, but it's not everything you see on that map. Like Jeff says, this map needs to be coordinated with the capital improvement program and the infrastructure so that we're programming improvements of roadways and extensions of water and sewer, and this map changes over time as we get there. But as we stand today, you've got areas on the far periphery that just aren't going to develop with any type of urban development, obviously.
when is the last time this map was updated?
Well, it was first created in 2015, and it's been updated several times as people come through and do comp plan amendments. So it's for specific projects. And I think the last kind of comprehensive, we'll do a review occasionally of, okay, what do we need to make any boundary changes? I think that was in 2018 or 19? 2020, okay. But those are fairly minor corrections, like, hey, we've got water and sewer out here now, let's make this urban low instead of urban future, things like that. But the southeast area is a great example of what, it's really hard to do urban development out there because there are really very few, if any, big chunks of land. So nobody's going to fund the cost of a water and sewer extension 5 miles to get there because there's just not big enough land, big enough sites to do like an R1 development. And so we want to avoid that. And that's great because that's what the people in the southeast area want. They want the rural area, and that's why the comp plan says what it says. But we don't have the ability to access that fantastic water resource. It has to be pumped all the way to other areas of the city. But we want to be cognizant of that situation and make sure that we're allowing ourselves the opportunity to develop urban densities in these other areas that are now kind of this urban-rural interface.
And you'll be able to rezone once we make a new map. Even we're changing the comp plan all the time as we do comp plan amendments. So you'll be able to rezone if it's RLAG and Tesla comes and puts water and sewer out there and now it's going to develop, then you pick a new zone and go to the planning commission and just get another one of the menu zones that we're creating. So it doesn't have to always be that one.
Similar to these questions, but coming into my ward in the core here a little bit, like you'd think we wouldn't deal with this, but we do all the time. Where we still even in Ward 6 have a pretty significant area of a lot of single family, and even in these areas in Ward 6 in downtown, right? You come in with like a duplex, and you got a fight on your hands. So my question is, right? Increment. Is there going to be thoughts towards like that incrementalism that can happen over time, where people understand that their neighborhood isn't going to be in its current character forever. It's a city, things change, growth occurs, and I just feel like in some way there's got to be a reduction of kind of what I see is like this, like not a straight entitlement, but like the entitled feeling to like being able to tell your neighbor what they can or cannot do with their property within some kind of reasonable boundary of context.
And that will come down to the mapping. Our chore is to basically create all the options and alternatives, and then it'll come down to, is this neighborhood going to remain entirely intact as it is with no changes? It's stable. We don't envision it changing. There's other areas that we're starting to see deterioration. We're starting to see encroachment of other uses. That neighborhood is going to more than likely turn over. So there they can have options for doing a duplex conversion, or maybe tearing down 2 or 3 single family and putting in a townhome. It just really depends on that area. We're not going to force a stable neighborhood to absorb multiplexes or something of that nature unless they're in context that they're ready to receive that.
Well, but why? I guess, but why not? So, Plan OKC calls for most of our core to be urban medium with higher density. I think it gets into a little bit of a subjective argument as to what's considered a stabilized neighborhood. And I guess it would be my opinion that all of the neighborhoods within the core of Oklahoma City should see increased density in some form, whether it's garage apartments or conversions. I think the only way to keep these rural areas rural is to be building more housing in and around downtown. It's not us not being able to do that is what's putting more pressure on more development to add more housing in the city further away. So it should almost be a by right zoning change, even if it's you get one additional unit than what exists today. I don't think allowing density in the core is going to destabilize the existing neighborhood.
Well, I think that's great point, and that's why Plan OKC, being just a general plan, says we want to put more density where appropriate. So we need to spend the next couple of years deciding with community input where it's appropriate, because we all know from being planning commission, city council meetings that, like was said a minute ago, some people feel really strongly about keeping my neighborhood exactly the way it is, and they're not going to support adding more density. Other neighborhoods welcome it with open arms, and there are a lot that are in between. So we always expected that we would have to do a lot of outreach and figure out where that density is inappropriate from a political, or where it's appropriate from a political perspective. Because like you're saying, from a technical perspective, yeah, we'd love to have density all over the place, but a lot of our residents disagree with that, and so we're gonna have to get that all worked out, and that's where it's gonna be some pretty detailed, a lot of outreach and a lot of conversation about that.
Well, I guess my original point was not that, like, not just acknowledging that we're gonna have to do that this time, but asking, you know, are we planning for the next 25 years right now, and then we're gonna let 25 years the next group handle it again, or are we providing kind of a way that the things that we don't foresee, or the growth that we don't nail it on, that it can happen naturally within this context and this code, versus us having to plan for it? Is there, you know, that leading edge, as it continues to grow out, as growth occurs, is that edge going to continue to expand with that? Are things going to naturally be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, out here, like, without having to, you know, have my input or your input, it's like, obviously, the character's changed in this neighborhood, and that means that the edge has moved, and that means that this next neighborhood is now, you know, things might start happening.
Yeah.
Is there like a control for incremental, you know, growth down the road without us having to, like, say, right there, that's the future for growth right here?
Yeah, it depends on how prescriptive we want to be, right? And there's a lot of market considerations that we can't anticipate, so we need to develop a code and districts and standards that will span whatever that looks like in the future and give those districts, regardless of what they are. So there may be a neighborhood that's all single family today, and people who live there today don't want it to change. That's not to say that it may be the same 10 or 15 years. You know, those will evolve, and then we'll start seeing, you know, more density coming into those neighborhoods. Well, they'll start selling or putting in accessory dwelling units or splitting them into duplexes or doing townhomes or something like that, you know. So we just need to be able to create districts that's going to provide for that.
Well, last comment from me, I swear, is that in regards to like, you know, well, neighborhoods that fight it less might then see more change, right? Well, we know how that goes, because it's the same that it goes currently, which means that the people, right, that have money and means, their neighborhoods are going to be stable, and everyone else, their neighborhoods are not going to be stable. And so, I guess what I'm looking for is there some other way, rather than the political approach, where it's just like, oh, well, you know, this neighborhood, they all came out, and so we're not going to change them, but, you know, the Spanish neighborhood over here that didn't even understand the notice we gave them, nobody came, and guess what? Now your neighborhood is getting the new mall or whatever. And to me, there's like that imbalance that already occurs, and I guess I'm wondering, is there a way, or do we even want to, are we approaching it in a way where we say this is more prescriptive, or more defined, so that it takes a little bit of that argument that means, and I'm not, you know, people should have a say, but I do believe, it's my personal opinion as a planning commissioner right now, that people actually have an outsized say versus what's good for you versus what's good for the city. And to me, I always look at it, what's good for the city. And I'd like us to be able to say that we nailed that in our approach.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, well, I think Brett answered it best when he said we need to set up that range of districts that meets the demands of the future. It's always, you know, under state law, it's a political process to map the districts. I mean, we cannot map the districts until it goes through you guys, and then it goes to the council. And that's it. Council's elected, y'all are appointed. It's inherently a political process, for better or for worse. So, you know, on the one hand, technically, that's always going to be the case, but I think the best way to deal with that is, number one, have a good long-range plan, which the city's done its homework on, I think. And then second, having that range of tools available in the code, and then planning for it. And it's always going to be hard. I mean, I think you raised a very good question. I mean, that's just reality. I mean, you're right. Some neighborhoods are more organized, and you get those folks who are professional people who've been through the process, and they hire lawyers or whatever, and they kind of get what they want. Other neighbors not so much, maybe. But I think having the tools in place in opening up and removing some of the other hidden regulatory barriers that people don't think about as much. Sometimes excessive minimum parking requirements. You know, a lot of stuff like that sometimes deliver outcomes that we don't even want will help as well, and will make getting some of that, the things the city has said it wants to see, and plan OKC on the ground. It's always going to be, but what you raise is always going to be an issue. I mean, I think that's just part of it.
It will. Sorry, I know I said this last. This is a question after general. Have you guys ever seen the city do that, where they have measures that automatically kind of like upzone over time?
Well, I think that's, I would like to add to this conversation, we talk a lot about this continuum, right? Going from agricultural and developed all the way to high intensity downtown, whatever. We're rewriting the ordinance, right? Like that, we're redoing the code. The code is there anything that would preclude us from saying, hey, by right, if you are already in a less intensive zone, you can go up to the next increment. You can't go up 3 increments, but you can go up 1 more increment, and you don't have to necessarily go through the full rezoning process because you're getting into that incrementalism. This is a continuum. A continuum, by definition, doesn't go in discrete units, right? So, what are our opportunities for putting that forward into our new development codes to say, all right now you might be, urban low intensity, but if you want to do an urban medium intensity development in this area, you don't need to go and get it rezoned. You can do that by right. And then, of course, as the maps get updated and you recognize that, hey, developers have made this organically to the next intensity, it just updates the map that way.
It's kind of your approach, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
offering.
That's an example of baking in to the regulations what can happen without having to go back in front of a rezoning and so we just kind of keep rezoning. So we can make those decisions. I just came from a city last night. We got a code adopted in Colorado, and we created ADU standards. The locals decided where they applied, what neighborhoods they would accept ADUs. We put in duplex conversions. That's in the code. They decided where it's appropriate that those neighborhoods could actually convert their single-family home into a duplex. We created all these different housing types, and they decided by where they placed the zones of how neighborhoods are going to change or not change in the future, and how we're going to create increased density. So that's what our job is basically write those down. Ultimately, it will become your job in terms of putting that on a map. But hearing this conversation is helpful for us to know what your thought process is, so as we're writing regulations, we can start thinking about how can we accomplish some of these things without adding extra hoops to jump through.
Well, having heard you say that, I feel compelled then to point out that there certainly is another side to this coin as well. I mean, first of all, I think you have to be very careful that there are not unintended consequences to what you're doing. You say, okay, here's the urban part of the city. Within this area, you can increase density. What you're really telling people is if you want to live in a single-family residential home, move farther out. And that's something we've been trying not to tell people for a long, long time.
That's not necessarily true because, again, if you're able to, by right, go up to the next increment, then there's no guarantee that
But you're talking about moving then into neighborhoods that have restrictive covenants. Newer neighborhoods, the old neighborhoods don't tend to, that say this can only ever be single-family residential. If you tell those people...
Well, that sounds like a ridiculous covenant, kind of like saying you can't have black people that live in this neighborhood.
Well, I beg to differ with that characterization, and I think you'll find that the courts do not see it that way. But you're also saying...
Historically, into single-family zoning, that was one of the goals of single-family zoning, was to make sure that the right people moved in and the wrong people didn't.
Well, be that as it may, we have a huge part of this city where residential development is governed by restricted covenants that permit only single-family residential use. The city can change the zoning all it wants to. That's still a legally enforceable requirement. And I think, we've been trying to talk people into coming into the city, not out. I don't think it's necessarily a healthy message to be sending them. that if they want to live in a single-family residential home, they should move farther out.
You're
So
gonna
I
run
think
into
that
a
is,
you're gonna,
that would be an unintended consequence of doing that.
fair enough, but you're gonna run into the geometric problem of there's only so much area you can develop at single family density
Yeah, I don't
before
see us
you
running
have
into
to
it
push
anytime
out.
soon. You know, we seem to be doing just fine. We'll keep going as long as there's any property out there.
I don't think, to me, I don't see it as us pushing anybody out, right? It's a question of, if you don't want to rezone your property or change your property, stay on it. Don't change
But
it.
that's not the point.
But if
So
the
people
property
want to
next
live in
door-
a single-family neighborhood. It's not just their little tract of land. Jim, you've heard these arguments. I'm not telling you something you don't know.
Right, but I don't
Approve.
But, sure, okay, in that sense, I don't approve of them, because to me, I believe in transects, and I do believe that the closest neighborhoods to downtown should be more dense than the neighborhoods outside. I think it's okay to say that. I think it's okay to want to accomplish that as a city. I think most cities' growth pattern is dense in the core and less dense outside. It's hard for me to say that if I came in and bought a home in one of the neighborhoods in the downtown ward right now, it would be hard for me to tell anybody that, yes, you can rely on your neighborhood being a single-family neighborhood in perpetuity forever. I mean, at what point does the city change? At what point do we grow up? Because right now, a lot of the discussions that I hear says, sorry, but this is the way it is and this is the way it's going to be. And so we're forcing ourselves into smaller and smaller
slices. The point at which
slices.
we change is the point at which it becomes economically feasible for somebody to take the risk to make that change.
But what happens, right, is you press against change for so long, it suddenly happens all at once. And it's like what's happening up at Pin 50 or whatever they call that development. It is a radical change now in the neighborhood because we didn't allow it to change over time. So it's never had any kind of release.
So what this process
I think it's very common in urban.
So what this process will do, will create urban single-family neighborhoods, and that may apply in some places. And it will create different development forms, and it will make a decision as to where those apply when we get to the zoning map. So we can create neighborhoods that will transition and will infill and will change over time to become more dense. You've got a lot of neighborhoods where you've got a lot of vacant lots or a lot of deteriorated homes. There's opportunities for infill of single family, there's opportunities for ADUs, potentially there's opportunities for tear downs and rebuilds. I don't know what the answer to that is, but we just need to create districts that basically provide for that. And then y'all make the decision as to where those districts go on the ground or how they change over the course of time. Just because they're single family today doesn't mean that 15 years from now, the people who live there still want to be single family. It may evolve over time. And then we need to have regulations that allow them to transition, allow those homes to, either rebuild or.
Yeah, we have some urban conservation districts that were set up decades ago, and people who live there now, not all of them certainly, some of them are very passionate about it, but people who live there now, and some of them just, they're not as passionate, they don't feel the same way that they do. Ownership has changed and things change, and we certainly want to anticipate that, but these discussions will be needing to have as we go forward and actually put this on the ground, because these are all valid points and will need to be considered as we decide on saying where should these zones go, where should we densify, to Mark's point.
Does Plan OKC generally arc towards density?
Yes, most certainly, and that's what scenario C was, which scenario C was the most dense scenario, most compact, so people chose overwhelmingly. So Plan OKC is designed around that, but it doesn't say that everywhere in the core is appropriate to jack up to maximum density, but certainly, yeah, in general, yeah.
But generally, the finding of Plan OKC was dense survival.
Yeah.
I think an important piece is going to be for the consultant and staff to actually get out in the core neighborhoods. I don't think it's appropriate, and Janice and I and Asa, we find ourselves myself working on behalf of the developer, having to, I don't use the word educate, the public about the city's policies, but when I just stand up there and say, the city just adopted something that says there should be no parking minimums, and that your neighborhood, per code, per comprehensive plan, says 40 dwelling units an acre, oh, your TOD, 60 dwelling units an acre, and they go, I don't care what they say, I've never heard that. I think the only way that we get there is if, through your process, you have extensive, not just outreach, but education on why it's important that some of these neighborhoods densify in whatever way that means. Whether it's from single family with garage apartments all the way up to 8 plexes and 16 plexes. I think it's going to be on like you all, which we hope goes well.
Good luck with that.
No, that's a great point. It has to be two-way. We have to be explaining and getting feedback at the same time, not just saying, hey, what do you all want?
Right. They don't trust us. Being an official city employee, maybe you'll have better luck.
So we've got 20 minutes left, so respect your time. We're going to kind of hit some of these points. So when we talk about rural, this is the type of thing that we're talking about, where rural low intensity is the typology, current zone is AA. We can create an RLAR, and then within that we can have 3 by right options. So if a developer's out there and he's got a piece of property that 2/3 of it's in the floodplain, or it's got, timberland or whatever that resource feature might be, he has a way of developing on that property without having to rezone it to get smaller lots so that he can develop around that resource. So this creates basically an incentive for preserving that open space, preserving that rural character, by giving them 3 different options, all by right. We're not telling them they have to do one or the other. They can make that decision for themselves based upon what the market is and based upon that piece of property. Typically when we do that, we will increase the open space as the lot size goes down, but we're also building in a density bonus. So we're rewarding people for preserving open space. They can make the decision for themselves, depending upon whether they want to do large lots or they want to cluster smaller lots. If you cluster smaller lots on that far right, you now have built in the character of that in perpetuity, because that land is not going anywhere, and they don't have to worry about what happens over the fence line, right? Because they have clustered in the middle of the property, they've surrounded themselves by land, whatever that might be. It could be farmland, it could be pasture land, it could be floodplain, it could be a creek, whatever that might be. So there are ways that we give them options. Today you'd have to go rezone to get something different. And this way we can maintain that rural character by giving them options that are all permitted by right. Sir, you had a quick question?
Yeah, real quick. Presently, you can't, if it's ag land, you can't rezone it unless they have utilities. That's part of the urban, whatever they call it, I call it the urban growth boundary. My question is, on that, what if there's no utilities? Could they do that with septic? Could they do that with propane? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so you would need, and this is something that the Planning Commission and Council have been dealing with, what is that line where the minimum lot size where you should be able to accommodate like septic. But in this case, on the one to the right, you could do that with no sewer if each lot was a half acre. Then you could do, under the current regime, you could do those. You could also do cluster developments in UL, which is an exciting concept in urban low, so in just standard residential with sewer, you can do these kinds of things and have this kind of common area and yet still have the same gross density.
And as we move into urban low and urban medium, you can start to introduce other housing types. So you can kind of create communities that you can have attached housing and detached housing. And again, we're creating options available to them that don't require rezoning. And they all have their own, they're all spelled out in terms of the open space, the amenity space, and the lot areas. And as I said, as the density goes up, then you can start trading in different housing types. If you want to do some attached housing or some condo maintenance-free housing, you can build that into this.
What are the lot sizes on the screen related to the rural low intensity zoning that you're showing?
This is just kind of illustrating, just trying to get the idea of, doing large lots. So if you want to say that's, 3-acre lots, they're covering every inch of that. They're ignoring any resources. All the resources on the side are now on a private lot. So if that private property owner decides to, mow down the trees or whatever, it's their private property. They have the right to do that, right? Or if there's a water feature, I work in communities where they have no way to maintain the water because it's private property, right? So in a neighborhood. So it could be, maybe it's 3 acres, maybe it's 1 acre, maybe it's a half acre, whatever that might be. We haven't really gotten into calibrating all these things, but we will look at that and say, okay, today they're getting 3 units per acre, or 2 units per acre. So tomorrow they can get 2 units per acre, or they can get 2.3 units per acre, or they can get 2.9 units per acre, depending upon which options make sense for them. This is a rural, urban, yeah.
So could there be like a fourth option over here to the right, where suddenly you're like, you know what? We're doing the same, so we're the same number of units, right? But we're gonna put them all in a single building.
Yeah.
Just for fun's
That's
sake.
the
Like
philosophy.
say, we're gonna do a tower here, and it's got the same number of units, but it's gonna be one building in the middle of that.
We can basically set a cap on the density. And if the developer wants to put an apartment building in the middle of it, the density is the
Well,
same.
it's right. I'm trying to set the boundary here.
Yeah, theoretically, yeah, but then the argument would be, well, tower there destroys the rural character, so. But yeah, theoretically, you can, the gross density remains the same no matter,
So it truly lets the market decide.
Yeah, these could all be attached houses. These could be single family. You can mix and match sizes of lots, larger lots, smaller lots. Most developments do that anyway, right? Different widths of lots.
What if you own a large amount of acreage? We're like one of these 80-acre parcels that's come through, and they say, we want to take advantage of this, but we want to add in a little bit of like commercial.
Yeah.
So right now, Wheeler District here in Oklahoma City is very popular. A lot of people are familiar with it. It's mixed use, and partially what I'm wondering is like in these like larger subdivision developments, can we help developers start to capture that same kind of character, which I feel like is going to continue to be.
But the key is that it needs to be of that character. It needs to be appropriately scaled for that character. If it's something too intense, it's not appropriate in the urban low area. It needs to go closer in town.
I'm
We
thinking
can do, commercial with pitched roads, a small square footage to blend in well with the neighborhood, and introduce commercial into these.
It's
Absolutely.
kind of become a trend around the country. ULI calls them agri-hoods.
Well, I grew up in
community gardens and a small shop or something.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that's what this concept is. That allows us to get something closer to that.
I'm from a small town, and I just imagine like, wouldn't it be great if you had all this land, if you could have that small town feel right out, in the outside. I feel like that's
Go to Serendipity sometime.
Yeah, Serendipity near Atlanta.
Outside of Atlanta.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the districts we've already kind of visited. And so, here's an example of it. Somebody can go off and build in a subdivision. There's really not any resources to speak of, so that's the choice that they had. The one on the bottom, now there's some creeks and streams and some wooded areas and so forth, so they've decided to cluster and to build on the developable part of land. They didn't have to rezone to do that. It's all permitted by right in the same district with different development options. So we'll be filling in these amenity spaces or these densities so that, basically, as we said, you can have a maximum density. You can really choose to develop it. As long as what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that it's still of a rural character. So it's very market responsive. Lot sizes can change. We can allow for clustering, which has a whole variety of benefits with respect to resource protection and stormwater, handling stormwater, and we can certainly include commercial uses within that and still maintain that intended character. So just kind of another example of ways that we can work in and around development and not have to go through a PUD to do this. It could be a by right based district. And then obviously as we move into the urban area, you're going to have more mixing of uses. We care, as we get go from rural to urban, we care less about use, and we start to care more about building form and scale and those types of things. A lot of different uses can go on within that box, but as long as it functions in that context, we're not as concerned about what that use is necessarily, unless it's a drive-through use or something of that nature. So there's a lot of trade-offs in the downtown. Obviously, parking's handled one way in the outlying areas, parking's handled very differently in an urban area, whether it's on street or structured parking or whatever that might be. So this is the urban low area. It's kind of hard to see on there, but it covers a lot of territory. That's looking at anywhere from 4 to 8 on single family or 15 to 30 on multifamily. Well, we all know those don't always go together, right? So we need to be able to build in how they transition, how we buffer them, thinking about everything else that goes into that design, from street design and traffic movement and so forth. So just some of the desired outcomes that were spelled out, some of what Jeff looked at earlier. Just kind of photos of different types that represent different use of building forms. So the urban area, this is a case where I highlighted. Today you have R2, R3, and R4, and we are consolidating that into a single district. So we're taking 3 districts and converting it into 1. And so that is intended to be where we have, mixed residential types. We can have infill standards and contextual development standards and all sorts of those types of standards to make sure that they fit within the context of where they are. And having design standards for, a neighborhood commercial needs to be neighborhood commercial. It needs to be limited in square footage, limited in height, have pitched roofs, deal with light, deal with traffic, those things, so that it can operate effectively within a neighborhood environment. It's not going to be a 10,000 or 30,000 square foot strip center, because that's not neighborhood, what would be neighborhood commercial. So basically taking all of your current districts and transitioning them and then thinking about the standards that we need to bake in to make sure that they reflect the ultimate character and the lumen that is in the plan. Just kind of some different ways. Mark mentioned earlier, you can look at text and you can look at graphics. So if we can use graphics to help illustrate different housing types and how we measure those housing types, whether they're on alley access or street access, where they sit on the lot, how we measure height, how we articulate building walls, things of that nature. We can do that with the use of graphics. That's a question, sir?
Yeah, just a question, just to understand. So when you do away with the 3 that currently exist and you make it 1 urban low, so does that mean that in a neighborhood, the developer's gonna have to put in all those 3 types of housing?
It depends on the context, not necessarily.
Depends on the context.
Well, it depends on where it's at. It depends on whether it's already built out or whether it's a open
Well,
greenfield.
yeah, I'm talking about in some of the urban low areas out there that haven't been zoned or anything. They're agriculture right now, or in urban reserve right now that could get pulled out of urban reserve.
Yeah, they would have they're going to have a certain density they can build to, right? So they can choose among those housing types.
But they will have to do all the housing types?
No, they're all permitted.
Okay.
They don't have to do that. We can structure the code if we're wanting to incentivize density. We can structure the code so we incentivize them to use other housing types because they're going to get more density, right? So say if you want to use this housing type, you're going to get 6 units per acre. But if you use these, we're going to give you 8 units per acre. Things like that we can use so the developer can decide, gee, I'd rather have 8 than 6. That works. It's the type of housing that I think the market needs.
So on the last slide, you had those 3, R2, R3, R4, going into 1 zoning category. And so if we go in for a rezoning and we say we want to build a duplex neighborhood, someone can come back and say, well, yeah, but you can also do R4 and I don't want apartments. That seems like that's going to head right back to a PUD.
Well, in your defense, I feel like it doesn't describe what R4 really is locally up here.
We haven't gotten there
Which
yet.
you would have had to use a PUD for under the current code.
I think what Mark is talking about is it's very common when you go to meetings with neighbors that, you know, they don't want to talk about what you're asking to do. They want to talk about what you would be permitted to do. So if you're asking for ULMX because you want to do a duplex, the neighbors are thinking, yeah, but you could go build, you know, apartments. That's what I want to talk about.
And then we get the planning commission and we're told, you really should just go do a PUD because you can alleviate all of their concerns because they just don't want that one thing. And then we go, okay, because we just want the project approved. So, I don't know, a little troublesome that those three get collapsed into one, just from a practical, not going to say that word right, to just get it approved when we want duplex and they're saying you could also do a large apartment. I'm okay with it, but I don't know.
But we can do things like on the property line that's adjacent to something of lesser intensity, you must also have lesser intensity along that property line. And then you can scale up, you know, where you may be adjoining commercial or something like that. So we can build in standards to make sure that if there's a row of single family homes and they're next to a vacant property and it happens to be zoned as ULMR, that we can effectively transition that by putting a buffer yard and making sure that the first row are also 2 stories, not 4 stories, and then, you know, further back. So there's a number of different ways that we can address that. You raised some great questions. We need to hear those things so we can think through those after crafting these.
Yeah, I think you're talking about, you know, providing certainty to the developers. I think there also has to be some certainty
Yes,
for
absolutely.
neighboring property owners.
Absolutely.
That they know what can be done.
Yeah, and I think that this is where it gets back to the compatibility and what Brett was alluding to earlier. This is where we're trying as much as we can to incorporate the notion of, and this is admittedly difficult for neighbors unless you come in there as a developer with lots of pretty pictures, so showing them how, hey, don't worry, all you're going to see is trees. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you know, because most people think, oh, they're going to build a 3-story garden apartment next door. They have the ability to do that. So we've got work to do. We understand that, and some selling to do to make sure, like you were saying earlier, to explain to people how this is going to work. You know, when yes, they have the ability to do that, but it comes with a lot of conditions. It's going to be, you know, we're going to make you whole. That's kind of our goal. And we'll talk about it as a group, and then if we feel like we can't get there, you know, we'll adjust this zone to only include R2 and R3. I mean, we've got a lot of room to work there.
I'll tell you, I think the biggest hurdle to achieving that goal really is the fact that, as we have told people just very recently, zoning really happens pretty early in the process.
Yeah.
You know, there are a lot of people coming to us for zoning that really don't know what the property is going to be when it grows up. They don't know what it will turn out to be.
And right now, your zoning districts allow so many different types of uses that you really have no idea, right? And all you can go on is what the zoning permits. You can't take their word for it because that can change, right? So what we want to do is we want to make that more definitive, that if it's zoned next to you, you know that there's protections built into the regulations so that no matter what they do, they're not going to be able to build a 5-story apartment building next to your single-story home. You know, there's going to be buffer yards, there's going to be, you know, stepping back, there's going to be, you know, concern with lighting, with traffic, with whatever that might be. Those are going to be baked into the regulations. So you have that certainty. So we've written things like, says, you know, if there's a piece of property next to the lots that are adjacent to that, can be no less than 85% or more than 115% of the lot width. Things like that, you know, so that you're not going to get those dramatic changes over a property line.
And I think a lot of that is the trouble when, as we're transitioning from, as you said, we're going into this, the more urban development approach. It's moving away from uses and it's moving towards that form base. So in a use base, yeah, you can do anything you want as long as it conforms to the use. In a form base, though, okay, the form doesn't allow for you to go from, like you said, single-family home, for example, to, you know, 3-story garden-style, you know, multi-acre apartment complex.
Right.
I agree with it in principle. It's just
it's a change.
You don't want. It's not even that it's a change. It's probably a positive change. I don't want to have to fight a battle for something a client doesn't want to build. And we can say it's the shape, it's the form, whatever, like, the reality is I don't want to live next to apartments is what you're going to battle. And if it's not what you're building, you're basically like, I don't even want to do that, and I'm being basically penalized with, protests and a process that.
We've had communities that say you can only build apartments if it's part of a mixed-use development. There is no apartment zone per se, because it's so difficult to get a piece of ground zoned to allow for multifamily if it's anywhere near single family. So it has to be within a master planned type of environment. So there's a lot of different ways that cities have dealt with those things.
That's a great point, Mark, and one that we've been cognizant of, but need to be. It's really going to take some work to get us to the right place there, and that's why we're so reliant on PUDs, because it's really nice and easy to tell somebody, don't worry, it's going to be this and only this. We're just looking at a case today. It's a one-use PUD, because then you can just say, don't worry, this is the zoning. But well, let's get real though. I mean, they often come in and change their zoning, and they want more uses, and so I mean, then it just was. We're trying to get to a point where because the planning commission's agenda is keeping longer and longer, meetings keep getting longer and longer. We have so many rezones, and a lot of them are PUDs because they have to come in and constantly adjust these things. And you're right, you don't want to get penalized for those, but at the same time, if we can get a good zone in there that's flexible and allows a lot of uses, and has all these standards baked in so people don't have to worry about incompatibility, we can avoid the number of times developers or owners have to go back and get a rezone for some other use because their plans change. So we're trying to hit that optimal, that happy medium, But
and I think that'll work if planning commission and city council are willing to tell a group of 20 protesters, this is the new code, we believe that the mitigation measures within it are sufficient.
Yeah.
If it's not, we're right back to where we started, and then we wonder why we're going through the process.
Yeah.
I'll tell you though, I would not be able to support a system that eliminates that conversation. Where you have code set up in such a way, you don't have to talk to the neighbors. You go in and you apply for this, and you have, a set of standards and controls, and so that's all the protection they need. And we don't have to take the time to go meet with the neighbors and find out what they think, or get their input at planning commission or whatever. I think
where do you
that
draw the
is
line?
a huge part of the process.
Yeah, it's just a matter of where you draw the line, because they still would for a rezone. They still might want a rezone between these new zones as well. So it's just that's what we're trying to decide is where do we draw that line where you come to a point where you really need a rezone and it's time to talk to the neighbors.
This might be a good example. The difference between a duplex and an apartment complex is pretty significant.
But the ULMR, the R4 that would go into that recipe is not the R4 of today.
Right.
It's not the, in fact, I went to Paseo to hand out some stuff about the surveys that we did, and there's an apartment complex there, it's white, it's on the corner of 29th or 30th of Paseo, it's the Paseo Little something. And I started to be the tour guide, people were asking me where this art gallery was and all this. I said, well, just beyond this apartment complex, you'll find that art gallery. They go, that's an apartment complex? And so to them, that wasn't an apartment complex, but it is. It's 32 units, it just doesn't look like that. So they have to start to think.
It's got the best courtyard in the city, too.
Does it? Yes, you can see it from the air, but
Yeah,
it
you
looks
should
really nice.
poke your head in there, it's amazing. Are we is the plan to have minimum and maximum lot sizes still? Are we gonna bake in like certain, I don't know.
Well, we've batted that around as to whether or not, in some cases, whether or not you really need lot size if you set densities and you set amenity space. Some communities have done, like a housing palette. So here's all the different housing types. Here's the different ways you park them and so forth. Here's the district, and here are the standards. And we're not going to tell you, what lot sizes there can be. In other cases, you set an average lot size, so they can do some large, some small, as long as they meet the average and don't exceed what's allowed in that district, and they do that. So we haven't gotten that far along yet to know exactly what that looks like. Yeah, I think I think we're essentially done because we're after 4 o'clock, so we looked at that. That's just, again, looking at some of the urban districts.
While you're flipping, the design review districts be consolidated if we're moving toward a code with some site plan controls? Is it- That would be my I guess that would be my push through this process in downtown. If we're putting in site plan controls, it allows staff to administer it rather than a body talking about brick color and window placement.
Yeah.
Procedurally, yes, if we can have good standards that are objective and clear and adopted to this process, if they could be handled by staff in an administrative standpoint.
Yeah, we've had those discussions, so coming soon is the category that we put that into. But yeah, we're kind of on the same page there.
Yeah. So
What a great way to end.
we kind of expected that we would have more content than time. So these are all good conversations. Thank you all very much. Very helpful.
We're talking about the next meeting being December 16th. I don't know.
December what?
December 16th. Y'all could email me, because we sort of decided that, this was kind of very complicated, so it's kind of part 1 of the discussion. So we were hoping maybe part 2 on December 16th, and we're hoping to move these meetings around a little bit. Y'all can email me on how you feel about that, but these meetings are open to the public, and if we were in different parts of town, maybe different people could come. And if you know any places in your areas that would have large spaces that you think would work, that would also be great. Great kids.
Free or cheap?
We've heard of Will Rogers Park, and the First Americans Museum has a place too, so we might be there.
What day of the week is the 16th?
I believe that's a Thursday. It's not planning commission.
Oh, okay.
Is it Board of Adjustment?
I'll look, and maybe we do it either, Board of Adjustment's usually in the morning, right? Or in the afternoon, so we might change it to a morning, so, but I'll let you know.
So the only homework is you have a miniature copy of the slides. We'll also post the slide deck to Teams and online. So tons of great discussion. Catalog all your thoughts and questions.
Are we going to be given any reading material or anything?
Any additional?
I can
Well,
get
this
that started on.
I did put some more reading material on Teams, so I'll work out to that.
Did you? Okay. I'm so bad at the teams.
Reading material being like, are these base districts like fairly well grouped together that we can review yet? And I will read that.
Probably after the 16th.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you.
If you can eliminate HB.
Oh,
That would be good.
Big fence,
Yeah.
agreed.
That's 2 votes, so it's a motion and a second.
Hey, I'm right here, guys.